Picture this. It's a cold October night in 1875, somewhere in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown. The fog rolls in thick off the bay, wrapping the narrow streets in a blanket of grey. Gas lamps flicker weakly against the darkness. And there, stumbling out of a doorway, marked only by a dim red lantern, comes a figure you'd recognize from every Western movie you've ever seen. Weathered leather chaps, dusty boots, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a cowboy. But he's not leaving a saloon. He's not drunk on whiskey. No, he's just spent the last 6 hours lying on his side in a cramped room, smoking pipe after pipe of opium, lost in dreams more vivid than any reality the frontier could offer. This isn't the Wild West you've seen on screen. The Hollywood version fed you a steady diet of whiskey-swilling gunslingers and rowdy saloon brawls. But here's the truth they didn't show you. More cowboys visited opium dens than saloons. More women were addicted to laudanum than their husbands were to alcohol. More children were dosed with heroin-laced medicine than you'd ever believe possible. Thus, Wild West wasn't just wild because of outlaws and shootouts. It was wild because nearly everyone was high on something. Morphine, opium, cocaine, laudanum, heroin. These weren't street drugs sold in dark alleys. They were medicines, sold over the counter, prescribed by doctors, given to babies, and nobody thought twice about it. Want to know what really happened when the American frontier met the most addictive substances known to humanity? Want to understand why your great-great-grandmother might have been a functioning opiate addict? Want to see how pharmaceutical companies created epidemics that make today's opioid crisis look like a rehearsal? Then settle in. Because what you're about to hear is the unfiltered, unvarnished truth about drugs in the Wild West. This is history they didn't teach you in school. This is the dark side of manifest destiny. This is what happened when an entire society lost itself to the poppy, the coca leaf, and the promises of snake oil salesmen who knew exactly how to create customers for life. The story begins not with a cowboy or a gunslinger, but with a flower. A delicate, beautiful flower that would flood westward with immigrants seeking gold and end up enslaving a generation. The opium poppy is deceptively beautiful, Papaver somniferum. Its petals range from white to deep purple, sometimes red, sometimes pink. It grows easily, asks for little, and offers so very much in return. For more than 3,000 years, humans have known its secret. Long before the cowboys rode into the sunset, long before America was even a thought, the ancient Sumerians were cultivating these flowers in Mesopotamia, 3,400 BC. They called it hulgil, the joy plant. They weren't wrong. The milky latex that oozes from cuts in the unripe seed pod contains a cocktail of alkaloids that can erase pain, create euphoria, and transport the mind to places the body could never reach. Morphine, codeine, thebaine, nature's pharmacy, wrapped in petals. The Greeks knew it. The Romans knew it. Islamic physicians refined its use through the Middle Ages. By the time European powers began carving up the world, opium was already a valuable commodity, traded along silk routes and shipping lanes. The British East India Company would eventually go to war with China over it, twice. That's how valuable this flower was. Wars were fought for the right to sell dreams. But our story doesn't start in Asia. It starts with ships. Ships arriving in San Francisco Bay in 1848, 1849, 1850. The California Gold Rush brought men from all over the world, but the largest group of non-European immigrants came from southern China. They called California Gamsan, Gold Mountain, and they brought their culture with them, including opium. For the Chinese immigrants, opium wasn't a vice. It was medicine, recreation, and tradition all rolled into one. After 12-hour days, building the Transcontinental Railroad, laying track through the Sierra Nevada in conditions that killed thousands, what could be wrong with smoking a pipe to ease the pain? What harm was there in a few hours of peace? The white Americans saw it differently. They saw opium as something foreign, exotic. dangerous, something Chinese. They would spend decades demonizing the Chinese for bringing opium to America, crafting racist legislation and fueling violence against immigrant communities. But here's the part they never mentioned in those moral crusades. White Americans loved opium too. They just preferred to drink it, inject it, and buy it from respectable pharmacies with fancy labels. The first opium den in San Francisco opened sometime around 1850. Nobody knows exactly when or where, but by 1860 there were hundreds. They clustered in Chinatown, tucked into basements and back rooms, marked by red lanterns and the sweet, cloying smell of opium smoke. They were simple places: a room, some wooden bunks or divans, oil lamps, and the equipment, the pipes, the needles, the lamps for heating the opium until it liquefied. You'd pay your money at the door, maybe 25 cents, maybe $1, depending on the quality of the opium and the fanciness of the establishment. Then you'd choose your spot. Lie down on your side. Someone would prepare the pipe for you. They'd take a small bead of opium, heat it over the lamp until it bubbled and smoked, then press it into the bowl of a long bamboo pipe. You'd inhale deeply, hold the smoke in your lungs, and exhale slowly. Then do it again, and again. The first pipe might not do much. The second would start to soften the edges of reality. By the third or fourth, the room would seem to glow with an inner light. Pain would evaporate. Anxiety would dissolve. Time would become irrelevant. Some men would smoke 10, 15, 20 pipes in a session. They'd lie there for hours, sometimes days, lost in vivid dreams and complete contentment. But here's what shocked Victorian America. It wasn't just Chinese immigrants smoking opium. White men started showing up. Cowboys, miners, railroad workers, gamblers. Then came the businessmen, sneaking away from their offices. Then came the women, society ladies, bored with their gilded cages, seeking adventure in the forbidden dens of Chinatown. Rich women, who would never be caught dead in a saloon, found themselves lying on wooden bunks next to prostitutes and laborers, all equal. In their pursuit of the poppy's gifts, the newspapers went wild. Scandalized reports of white women in opium dens became a moral panic. Not because opium was dangerous, mind you. White women could buy morphine and laudanum at any pharmacy without raising an eyebrow. No, the panic was about race mixing, about respectable white women in Chinese establishments, about the breakdown of social order. But the women kept coming, because opium offered something the frontier didn't: escape. For women trapped in loveless marriages, facing childbirth without anesthesia, suffering from chronic pain in an era when women's complaints were dismissed by male doctors, opium was liberation. It was dangerous, yes. It was addictive, absolutely. But it was also a brief vacation from a hard life. And the frontier was brutally hard. No air conditioning in 100-degree desert heat. No painkillers except alcohol and opiates. No antibiotics for infections. No treatment for tuberculosis. No relief for the grinding poverty most people endured. Manual labor from sunup to sundown. Women dying in childbirth. Children dying from diseases we can now cure with a pill. Life expectancy was 40 years if you were lucky. So when a magical substance comes along that makes all of that bearable, that turns pain into pleasure and exhaustion into euphoria, people embrace it. They embrace it hard, and they don't let go. As the railroad expanded westward through the 1860s, opium dens followed the tracks. Every major railroad town had them, some out in the open, some hidden. Sacramento, Reno, Salt Lake City, Cheyenne, Omaha, Denver. They were everywhere, and so was the customer base. Laborers, yes, but also lawyers, doctors, clergymen, sheriffs. The local elite might publicly condemn the Chinese for their opium smoking, while privately visiting the same establishments under cover of darkness. One of the most shocking revelations that emerged years later was about some of the Wild West's most famous names. Wild, Bill Hickok, the legendary gunslinger, was a regular at opium dens. Kit Carson, the famous frontiersman and scout, spent considerable time in opium parlors. These weren't secret scandals uncovered after their deaths. People at the time knew. They just didn't care the way history books later pretended they should have. Because here's the thing about frontier morality. It was flexible. Survival came first, comfort second, judgment a distant third. If a man worked hard, kept his word, and could handle himself in a fight, nobody particularly cared what he did for recreation. Drink whiskey until you passed out, fine. Gamble away your wages, your business. Smoke opium for 3 days straight, as long as you showed up for work eventually. The economics of opium were straightforward. China produced it cheaply. Ships brought it to San Francisco. Distributors moved it inland. A pound of quality opium might cost $5 and could provide hundreds of individual doses. The profit margins were extraordinary. Opium dens became lucrative businesses, and not just for Chinese proprietors. White Americans quickly saw the profit potential and opened their own establishments. By 1870, San Francisco alone had over 200 opium dens. The city's Chinese population was around 12,000, but the dens served far more customers than that. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 10% of San Francisco's total population used opium regularly. 10%. In a city of 150,000 people, that meant 15,000 regular users. And San Francisco wasn't unique. The really insidious part was how quickly addiction took hold. Opium's addictive properties weren't immediately obvious to users. You might smoke recreationally for weeks or months before realizing you needed it. Not wanted it, needed it. The withdrawal symptoms were brutal. Muscle aches, nausea, insomnia, anxiety, sweating, shaking. Your body screaming for more of what it had come to depend on. Once hooked, users faced a terrible choice. Keep using and maintain the habit, requiring more money and more opium over time as tolerance built. Or suffer through withdrawal, which could take weeks and felt like dying. Most chose to keep using, some for years, some until opium killed them. But the opium dens, visible and controversial as they were, represented only a fraction of the opium consumption in the Wild West. Most people never set foot in a Chinese establishment. They didn't need to, because the American medical establishment had a solution. A refined, concentrated, injectable solution that was about to change everything. The hypodermic needle was coming, and with it, morphine was about to become America's favorite drug. In 1803, a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Serturner isolated something remarkable from opium. He took the raw opium latex, the sticky brown resin that oozed from poppy pods, and through a series of chemical processes, he extracted a pure white crystalline powder. This powder was 10 times more potent than raw opium. He called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was fitting, because morphine promised the same thing Morpheus offered in mythology: sleep without nightmares, release from suffering, a gentle escape from the harshness of reality. And for decades, it delivered on that promise, at least until the bill came, due. At first, morphine wasn't widely adopted. The problem was efficiency. When you took morphine by mouth, it worked, but slowly and unpredictably. Your stomach had to break it down, your intestines had to absorb it, and by the time it reached your bloodstream, much of its potency was lost. Some doctors mixed it with whiskey or wine to improve absorption, creating tinctures that packed a serious punch. But it still wasn't fast enough or reliable enough for serious medical applications. Then everything changed. In 1853, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood perfected the hypodermic syringe. Suddenly, morphine could be injected directly into the bloodstream. The effects were immediate and intense. Pain vanished within seconds. Euphoria followed close behind. For patients suffering from agonizing conditions, it was nothing short of miraculous. But this miracle was about to collide with the greatest horror America had yet experienced: the Civil War. April 1861. Fort Sumter falls to Confederate forces. Brother turns against brother. The nation tears itself apart. And over the next 4 years, 600,000 men will die in the bloodiest conflict in American history. Many more will wish they had. Picture a battlefield hospital in 1863, Gettysburg perhaps, or Antietam. The wounded pour in faster than surgeons can handle them. Men with bullet wounds, shrapnel injuries, shattered bones. The screaming is constant. The smell of blood and gangrene fills the air. Amputations happen by the hundreds, often without anesthesia. Surgeons work for 20 hours straight, their aprons soaked red, their sores sticky with tissue and bone. Into this hell comes morphine. For the surgeons, it's a godsend. Inject a wounded soldier before amputation, and he'll drift away into unconsciousness. He won't feel the saw cutting through his femur. He won't remember the horror. And after the surgery, when the pain threatens to kill him, more morphine keeps him comfortable. Dose after dose after dose. The Union and Confederate medical departments distributed morphine liberally. Field hospitals had it by the barrel. Medical officers carried it constantly. In the early years of the war, when supplies were plentiful, morphine was often given as a pill or powder applied directly to open wounds. The powder would dissolve in the blood and tissue, providing some relief. Later, as syringes became more available, injection became the preferred method. Nobody tracked dosages carefully. Nobody understood addiction. The prevailing medical wisdom held that morphine was safe as long as it was administered by a doctor for legitimate medical purposes. That turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Soldiers received morphine not just for severe injuries. Doctors prescribed it for camp diseases. Dysentery was rampant in military camps, where thousands of men lived in close quarters with poor sanitation. Morphine was used to treat the cramps and diarrhea. Malaria swept through regiments stationed near swamps and rivers. Morphine for the fever and chills. Pneumonia, bronchitis, even scurvy. The answer was often morphine. By the war's end in 1865, conservative estimates suggest that 400,000 soldiers had developed morphine addiction. Some historians put the number even higher. It became known as soldier's disease or army disease. Entire veteran populations returned to their homes unable to function without regular doses. These weren't weak men. They had survived the carnage of places like Shiloh, Chancellorsville, and Cold Harbor. They had endured forced marches, starvation, disease, and wounds that would have killed their grandfathers. But morphine had them in a grip they couldn't break. What did morphine addiction look like? In the short term, it was manageable. As long as an addict had access to morphine, they could function relatively normally. The drug was cheap, legal, and available at any pharmacy. You didn't need a prescription. You could buy morphine tablets, morphine powder, or even a syringe kit complete with vials of injectable solution. Some veterans maintained their habits for decades without anyone noticing, but miss a dose, and the suffering began. First came anxiety and restlessness, then muscle aches that felt like your bones were breaking, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea. Your skin would crawl. You'd sweat profusely even in freezing weather. Sleep became impossible, but exhaustion overwhelmed you. Every nerve in your body would scream, and the psychological torment matched the physical agony. Depression, panic, an overwhelming sense of doom. The only cure was more morphine, and the cycle tightened its grip. For soldiers returning to the frontier territories, morphine addiction created unique challenges. Towns were small and spread out. Supply lines were unreliable. A veteran might settle in a remote mining camp or homestead far from any pharmacy. What happened when the morphine ran out? Some men made desperate rides to the nearest town, traveling for days just to secure their supply. Others turned to opium dens as a substitute. Still others tried to quit cold turkey, locking themselves in cabins or barns and riding out the withdrawal, alone. Some succeeded, most didn't. And some died trying, either from the physical stress of withdrawal or from suicide when the psychological torment became unbearable. The medical establishment was slow to recognize the problem. Many doctors genuinely believed that morphine administered for legitimate pain couldn't cause addiction. They thought addiction only happened when people used morphine recreationally. This belief persisted for decades, causing untold harm. Even more perversely, when doctors finally acknowledged morphine addiction, their solution was often to prescribe more morphine. The logic went like this. If a patient is suffering from morphine withdrawal, giving them morphine relieves that suffering. Therefore, prescribing morphine for addiction is treating a medical condition. Some doctors maintained addicted patients on morphine for years, justifying it as harm reduction before that term even existed. The worst cases involved doctors prescribing morphine to treat alcoholism. The thinking was that morphine addiction was less socially destructive than alcohol addiction. A morphine addict could hold a job, maintain a family, and function in society as long as they had access to their drug. An alcoholic was seen as unpredictable, violent, and unemployable, so doctors would take alcoholics and deliberately addict them to morphine as a form of treatment, trading one addiction for another with the full endorsement of medical science. Women were particularly vulnerable to morphine addiction, though for different reasons than soldiers. Female patients in the 19th century faced a medical establishment that was dismissive, paternalistic, and often actively harmful. Women's complaints were frequently attributed to hysteria, nervousness, or weakness of character. But morphine worked regardless of the cause. Menstrual cramps, back pain, headaches, depression, anxiety. Morphine fixed everything, at least temporarily. Doctors prescribed it freely to women, too freely. Many female patients became addicted without realizing what was happening. They'd visit the doctor for legitimate pain, receive a prescription for morphine, and within weeks or months find themselves dependent. Some women never even knew they were taking morphine. Pills were labeled with brand names, or simply marked as pain medicine. One particularly dark aspect of women's morphine use involved childbirth. Labor and delivery in the 19th century was excruciating and dangerous. No epidurals, no modern anesthesia. Women routinely died in childbirth, and those who survived often suffered severe injuries that caused chronic pain. Doctors administered morphine during difficult labors and continued prescribing it afterward for recovery. New mothers would find themselves addicted while trying to care for infants, creating a nightmare scenario of dependency and maternal responsibility colliding. The social dynamics of morphine addiction differed dramatically from opium smoking. Opium dens were seen as dens of vice, places where moral decay festered. But morphine obtained from a pharmacy with a doctor's recommendation, that was respectable. That was medicine. A woman could be a morphine addict and still attend church, host tea parties, and maintain her social standing. As long as she was discreet about her consumption, nobody questioned it. This created a hidden epidemic. Statistics from the era are incomplete and unreliable, but some estimates suggest that by 1880, more women than men were addicted to opiates in America. The typical addict wasn't a Chinese immigrant or a Civil War veteran. It was a middle-aged white woman taking medicine prescribed by her doctor. The pharmaceutical industry recognized this market and catered to it aggressively. Companies developed morphine tablets in various strengths, morphine solutions in attractive bottles, and even morphine-laced candies. The packaging was elegant, medical, reassuring. These weren't drugs. They were remedies, tonics, cures for modern ailments, and they came with the implicit promise that respectable people used them. But addiction doesn't care about respectability. It doesn't matter if you're smoking opium in a Chinatown den or taking morphine tablets from a crystal bottle on your nightstand. The result is the same. Your body becomes dependent. Your life revolves around securing your next dose. And escaping becomes almost impossible. By the 1880s, morphine addiction was so common that it had become normalized in many communities. Small-town pharmacists knew exactly which customers would be in every week for their morphine supply. Doctors knew which patients were addicted, but continued prescribing anyway. Families learned to accommodate the addicted members' needs, often in secret. The frontier territories were hit particularly hard. Isolation, harsh conditions, limited medical care, and easy access to morphine created perfect conditions for widespread addiction. Mining towns, where injuries were common and medical care was basic, saw especially high rates. Cowboys working, cattle drives dealt with chronic pain from injuries and often self-medicated with morphine or its liquid cousin, laudanum. Laudanum. That's where we need to go next. Because if morphine was America's secret shame, laudanum was its open secret. A liquid that every household kept on hand. A remedy that every mother gave her children. A solution to every problem that eventually became the problem itself. Open the medicine cabinet of any frontier home in 1870, and you'd find a small brown bottle with a cork stopper. Inside, a dark reddish-brown liquid, bitter and medicinal smelling. On the label, one word: laudanum. Laudanum wasn't a brand name. It was a type of medicine, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, usually flavored with something sweet or spicy to mask the terrible taste. Cherry, vanilla, orange, lemon, cinnamon. The recipe varied, but the key ingredients were constant. Opium and alcohol, typically in a ratio that made the final product about 10% opium and between 20 and 50% alcohol. Think about that for a moment. A typical dose of laudanum contained enough opium to produce noticeable effects and enough alcohol to qualify as hard liquor. People took it by the spoonful, sometimes multiple times a day, for ailments real and imagined. And nobody considered it drug abuse. It was just medicine. The uses for laudanum were almost endless. Got a toothache? Laudanum. Headache? Laudanum. Menstrual cramps? Laudanum. Can't sleep? Laudanum. Nervous disposition? Laudanum. Diarrhea? Coughing? General malaise? Laudanum for all of it. It was the aspirin of the 19th century, except vastly more powerful and devastatingly addictive. Every pharmacy stocked it. Every general store sold it. You could order it from mail-order catalogues. Price varied by location and quality, but generally, an ounce bottle cost somewhere between 25 cents and $1, cheap enough that even poor families could afford to keep it on hand. The accessibility made addiction inevitable. Someone would start taking laudanum for a legitimate ailment. Maybe a woman with severe menstrual pain would take a spoonful every month during her cycle. Relief was immediate and profound. The pain would vanish, replaced by a gentle warmth and sense of well-being. Why suffer when relief was just a spoonful away? So next month, she'd take a bit more, and maybe she'd take some between cycles too, for headaches, or just to smooth out the rough edges of frontier life. Within months, she'd need it daily. Within a year, she'd need it multiple times daily. And by that point, stopping wasn't optional. Her body required laudanum to function normally. Without it, withdrawal would make her violently ill. But here's the insidious part. Laudanum addiction was so common that it was essentially normalized. Women were expected to be delicate, prone to various complaints, in need of medical support. Taking laudanum regularly fit perfectly within acceptable feminine behavior. A woman could be visibly addicted, taking frequent doses throughout the day, and as long as she maintained her domestic duties and social obligations, nobody intervened. In fact, women were far more likely than men to become laudanum addicts. Medical historians estimate that 2/3 of opiate addicts in 19th century America were women. Not because women were weaker or more prone to addiction, but because the medical system prescribed opiates to women far more freely than to men. A man complaining of pain might be told to tough it out. A woman would be given laudanum. The results were predictable and tragic. Entire generations of frontier women lived their lives in an opiate haze, managing households and raising children, while dependent on a drug that slowly destroyed them. Some maintained their addictions for decades. Others increased their dosages until overdose became inevitable. Overdose was a constant danger with laudanum. The potency varied wildly between bottles and manufacturers. A dose that provided mild relief from one bottle might be too weak, prompting the user to take more. Then the next bottle might be twice as strong, and that same larger dose could be fatal. People died from accidental overdoses regularly, and intentional overdoses were even more common. Suicide by laudanum became grimly familiar in frontier towns. The method was simple and relatively painless. Drink enough laudanum, lie down, drift into unconsciousness, and never wake up. For people trapped in unbearable circumstances, it offered an escape. Prostitutes were particularly likely to die by laudanum suicide. The life of a frontier prostitute was brutal beyond description. Disease, violence, poverty, addiction, and social ostracism combined to create existences of pure misery. Many turned to laudanum for temporary relief from their circumstances. Some eventually turned to it for permanent relief. Take Sally Talbot, just 21 years old, working in a brothel in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1873. The historical records are sparse, but they paint a picture of a young woman who saw no way out. She obtained a large bottle of laudanum, drank the entire contents, and was found dead in her room the next morning. Her death was reported in the local newspaper with a tone of weary inevitability, as if young prostitutes dying by laudanum was just part of life on the frontier. Because it was. Laura Steele in Virginia City, Nevada in 1875. Same story, same method, same outcome. Ida Vernon, also Virginia City. The names pile up in historical records, each one representing a life that laudanum both sustained and ultimately ended. The newspapers might mention them in a paragraph or two before moving on to other news. Nobody asked why so many young women chose death over their circumstances. Nobody questioned a system that made laudanum their only constant companion. Even famous figures weren't immune. Eleanor Dumont, better known as Madame Moustache, was a legendary gambler who worked mining camps across Nevada, Montana, Arizona, and California. She ran card games, managed gambling halls, and built a reputation as a skilled dealer and a fierce personality. But success didn't protect her from laudanum. After losing a significant amount of money and facing an uncertain future, she took a lethal dose. Her body was found outside Bodie, California in 1879. But suicide wasn't the only way laudanum killed. Chronic use caused devastating health effects. The high alcohol content destroyed livers. The opium content caused severe constipation that could last for weeks, sometimes leading to intestinal blockages. Malnutrition was common as addicts lost interest in food. Dental decay from the sugar and acid in flavored laudanum was universal among regular users. Then there was the effect on mental faculties. Long-term laudanum users often seemed to exist in a fog. Their memories became unreliable. Their ability to focus deteriorated. Some developed hallucinations or paranoia. The line between taking laudanum for pain and taking it to maintain addiction blurred until it disappeared entirely. Children suffered too. Mothers addicted to laudanum during pregnancy often gave birth to addicted infants. These babies would go through withdrawal in their first days of life, screaming inconsolably, unable to feed properly, sometimes dying from the stress. For those who survived, the early exposure likely had long-term developmental effects that were never documented or studied. Even worse, laudanum was routinely given to children for minor complaints. Baby crying too much. A few drops of laudanum in milk would quiet them instantly. Child restless at night. Laudanum ensured sleep, coughing, teething, general fussiness. The answer was always laudanum. Parents genuinely believed they were helping their children. They had no idea they were dosing them with opium and alcohol. Some children died from these practices. A mother might give her baby too large a dose, or a second caregiver might give another dose, not knowing the child had already been medicated. Infant deaths from laudanum overdose were common enough that doctors began warning against the practice, but the warnings were largely ignored. Laudanum worked. It stopped crying, enabled sleep, and made childcare manageable. The risks seemed abstract compared to the immediate relief. The marketing of laudanum was sophisticated and insidious. Manufacturers gave their products reassuring, Names: Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, McMunn's elixir of opium. The labels featured gentle imagery, testimonials from satisfied customers, and promises of relief from every ailment. The word opium often appeared on labels, but in small print, surrounded by text about natural remedies and proven effectiveness. Customers knew what they were buying, but the presentation made it seem safe, medicinal, necessary. Some formulations were specifically marketed to women. The advertisements spoke directly to female concerns, promising relief from monthly pains, nervous conditions, and the exhaustion of domestic life. They positioned laudanum as an ally, a friend who understood a woman's burdens. The subtext was clear. You deserve relief. You don't have to suffer. This medicine is for you, and women bought it. Buy the bottle, buy the dozen. They kept it in medicine cabinets, kitchen cupboards, bedroom nightstands. Some carried small bottles, in their purses or pockets, taking discreet sips throughout the day. In social settings, it wasn't uncommon for women to share laudanum the way we might share aspirin today. Someone mentions a headache, and out comes a bottle. Just a spoonful, it really helps. The temperance movement, which focused primarily on alcohol prohibition, initially ignored laudanum. This seems strange until you remember that temperance advocates were mostly women, and many of those women used laudanum themselves. They could rail against the moral degradation of saloons while taking opium daily without seeing any contradiction. Alcohol was destroying men and families. Laudanum was medicine. Eventually, some temperance advocates made the connection. If alcohol was dangerous and laudanum was half alcohol and half opium, maybe it deserved scrutiny too. These voices remained marginal in the movement for years, but they laid groundwork that would eventually matter. By 1890, laudanum had become such a fixture of American life that its dangers were almost invisible. It was everywhere, used by everyone, killing people quietly and consistently. The death toll was impossible to calculate. How do you separate deaths from laudanum addiction from deaths from the underlying conditions people were treating? How do you count the lives diminished but not ended? The decades lost to fog and dependency? The truth is, you can't. But the scale was enormous. If 2/3 of opiate addicts were women, and conservative estimates put the total number of addicts at several 100,000 by 1890, then we're talking about a hidden epidemic affecting hundreds of thousands of American women. Frontier, women especially, living in isolation, dealing with hardship, self-medicating, with the only reliable medicine they had access to. And laudanum wasn't the only opiate problem. Because while American women were drinking laudanum in their kitchens, American men were seeking something more exotic, more atmospheric, more connected to the mythology of the frontier. They were visiting places that would become synonymous with vice and degradation, places that still capture our imagination today. Let me take you somewhere. Somewhere you've seen in movies but never really understood. We're in San Francisco, 1885. It's just past midnight on a Thursday in March. Light rain falling, making the cobblestones slick and reflective. You're in Chinatown, specifically on a narrow alley off Waverly Place. The street signs are in Chinese characters you can't read. Paper lanterns cast pools of orange light. You can hear Cantonese spoken in nearby doorways. You're looking for a red lantern, there, above a door with peeling black paint. No sign, no indication of what lies beyond. But you've been told this is the place. You knock 3 times. Wait. The door opens just wide enough for a face to peer out, evaluating you. A few words in Chinese you don't understand. Then the door swings open. The smell hits you first. Sweet, thick, cloying. Burnt sugar mixed with flowers and something darker, almost bitter. Opium smoke. It hangs in the air like fog. The hallway is narrow, walls close on both sides. The floor creaks under your feet. Dim light from oil lamps barely illuminates the way forward. You're led through the hallway to a larger room. The ceiling is low, maybe 7 feet high. The walls are covered in faded red fabric. More oil lamps provide just enough light to see. Buy. And there, arranged along the walls and in rows across the floor, are the bunks. Wooden platforms, maybe 3 feet wide, with thin mats or pillows. Some are occupied, bodies lying on their sides, some motionless, some moving slowly, reaching for pipes or lamps. The atmosphere is strange. It's not social like a saloon. There's no laughter, no loud conversation, just quiet murmurs, the occasional cough, the sound of breathing. Most people here are in their own world, eyes half closed or staring at nothing, lost in whatever visions opium is showing them. You pay your money to an older Chinese woman who seems to run the place. 75 cents for the night, which includes access to a bunk and the equipment you'll need. She shows you to an empty spot. It's not much, a wooden platform with a thin mat, a small pillow that's seen better days. Next to the bunk is a low table with an oil lamp already burning, and the equipment. The pipe is beautiful in its way. Bamboo, about 2 feet long, with a ceramic bowl attached about a third of the way from one end. The bowl has a small hole in the top. The bamboo is smooth from thousands of hands, darkened with age. Next to it, a long metal needle and a small container of opium. The opium itself doesn't look like much. Dark brown, almost black, with the consistency of thick honey or tar. This is chandu, prepared opium specifically for smoking. Raw opium has been boiled, strained, aged, and processed to increase potency and improve the smoking experience. It's more expensive than raw opium, but worth it for regular users. Someone comes to help you. A young Chinese man, maybe 20 years old, who's worked in dens like this since he was a teenager. He doesn't speak much English, but he doesn't need to. This is a practiced ritual. He takes the needle, heats it over the lamp flame until it's hot, then dips it into the opium container. The opium sticks to the hot needle, becoming slightly liquid. He shapes it into a small bead, about the size of a pea, rolling and heating it until it's the right consistency. Then he presses the bead into the hole in the pipe bowl. It sticks there, still soft. He holds the bowl over the lamp flame, not touching it, just close enough that the heat causes the opium to liquefy and bubble. You see smoke beginning to rise. That's your cue. You lie on your side. Position the pipe so the bowl is over the lamp flame. Put your lips to the other end of the bamboo and inhale. Slow and steady. The smoke is thick, sweet, harsh in your throat. You hold it in your lungs as long as you can, then exhale. A cloud of sweet smoke. The assistant is already preparing the next bead. The first pipe doesn't do much. You feel a slight warmth, maybe a bit of relaxation, but nothing dramatic. The second pipe starts to change things. Colors seem slightly more vivid. The oil lamp flame becomes mesmerizing. Your body feels heavier, like you're sinking into the mat. Pleasant heaviness, not uncomfortable. By the third pipe, the effects are undeniable. Any pain you had is gone, completely erased. Anxiety, stress, worry, they all dissolve like sugar in hot water. You're aware of your body, but distantly, as if it belongs to someone else. Your mind feels clear and clouded at the same time. Thoughts come slowly, drifting like leaves on a stream. The fourth pipe. Time stops meaning anything. Has it been 10 minutes? An hour? Impossible to tell. The room around you fades. The other people, the sounds, the smell, they're all still there, but they're not important. What's important is the sensation of floating, of being untethered from everything that normally anchors you to reality. Some people stop here. 4 or 5 pipes is enough for a pleasant experience that lasts a few hours, but others keep going. 6 pipes, 8, 10. Each one takes you deeper. Eventually, you're not really conscious in any meaningful sense. You're dreaming with your eyes open. Vivid images play out behind your eyelids. Memories mixed with fantasies. Mixed with things that feel more real than reality ever did. This is what people came for. This complete escape. For a cowboy who spent months on a cattle drive, sleeping on hard ground, eating beans and jerky, dealing with danger and discomfort and crushing boredom, opium was paradise. For a miner who worked underground in terrible conditions, breathing, dust, always one tunnel collapse away from death, opium was freedom. For anyone living a hard life, which was most people, opium offered a vacation you couldn't afford any other way. But the clientele wasn't who you'd expect. Sure, there were Chinese immigrants, laborers, railroad workers. But walk through a San Francisco opium den in 1880 and you'd see diversity that would shock Victorian society. White men in expensive suits, clearly businessmen or lawyers, lying, next to black porters still in their work clothes. Mexican vaqueros next to Irish dock workers, and women. More women than the newspapers ever admitted. Some dens catered specifically to white clientele, charging higher prices and offering nicer accommodations, private rooms instead of communal spaces, better quality opium, attractive young women to prepare the pipes and provide company. These upscale establishments were expensive, $1 or more per visit, but they attracted customers who wanted privacy and discretion. The women who visited opium dens came from all social classes. Prostitutes, certainly, for whom opium was both recreation and coping mechanism, but also shopgirls, housemaids, and the daughters of respectable families seeking thrills. Some came with men, either husbands or clients. Others came alone or in small groups. The relationship between opium dens and prostitution was complicated. Many dens employed women who were available for more than just preparing pipes. The line between opium den and brothel was often blurred, but not all dens operated this way, and not all women in dens were prostitutes. Some were simply addicts, same as the men, seeking their drug of choice in the most reliable location. The famous names who frequented opium dens represented a cross-section of Wild West mythology. Wild Bill Hickok was known to spend days at a time in opium dens during his later years. Kit Carson, the legendary frontiersman, was open about his opium use. Even some lawmen, the very people tasked with maintaining order, were regular patrons. It was, in many ways, the worst-kept secret of the frontier. The experience of addiction varied. Some people could use opium recreationally without becoming dependent. They'd visit a den once a month, or after particularly difficult work periods, and then go weeks or months without feeling the need. But they were the minority. Most regular users found themselves physically dependent within months. The nature of opium addiction is insidious, because it's not like alcohol addiction. An opium addict can function normally as long as they have access to their drug. They can work, maintain relationships, fulfill responsibilities. The drug doesn't impair judgment or coordination the way alcohol does, so addicts could maintain their habits for years without obvious consequences. The consequences came gradually. Tolerance built, requiring more opium to achieve the same effects. Costs increased. Time spent in dens increased. Withdrawal became more severe. Eventually, users reached a point where they needed opium just to feel normal, not to get high. They'd wake up in withdrawal every morning, feeling terrible until they got their first pipe. That became the new baseline. Some people spent entire lives as functional opium addicts. They'd work during the day, visit a den in the evening, smoke a few pipes, go home, sleep, and repeat. Years would pass this way. Decades, sometimes. The drug didn't kill them quickly like alcohol might. It just occupied more and more of their lives until nothing else mattered. Others spiraled faster. They'd start missing work to spend more time in dens. Relationships would deteriorate. Money would run out. Some turned to crime to fund their habits. Theft was common. So was prostitution, for women with no other options. The descent from recreational use to desperate addiction could happen over months or stretch across years. But the destination was the same. The physical toll of chronic opium smoking was significant. Respiratory problems were universal. Chronic cough, reduced lung capacity, increased susceptibility to pneumonia and tuberculosis. Malnutrition was common, as addicts spent money on opium instead of food. Dental problems from the smoke and poor hygiene. Skin problems. Infections from unsanitary conditions in low-end dens. And then there was the social toll. families torn apart by addiction, children neglected or abandoned, communities dealing with crime and poverty linked to opium use. The Chinese immigrants, already facing brutal racism and discrimination, were blamed for bringing opium to America, even though white Americans were enthusiastic participants in the trade and consumption. The anti-Chinese sentiment that exploded in the 1870s and 1880s used opium as a justification. Newspapers ran sensationalized stories about white women being seduced and corrupted in Chinese opium dens. The reality was more complicated, as white women chose to visit these establishments for their own reasons. But racism doesn't care about nuance. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigration, was partly justified by opium concerns. But while America was having a moral panic about Chinese opium dens, a new drug was being quietly introduced into every pharmacy, general store, and medicine cabinet in the country. A drug that was legal, widely available, heavily marketed, and considered completely safe by the medical establishment. A drug that would prove even more dangerous than opium in many ways. Cocaine was coming to the frontier, and nobody saw the danger until it was far too late. The coca plant grows in the Andes Mountains of South America, where indigenous people have chewed its leaves for thousands of years. The leaves provide energy, suppress appetite, and help with altitude sickness. Chewing coca leaves is relatively mild and addiction is rare. But in 1859, a German chemist named Albert Niemann figured out how to isolate and purify the active compound. He called it cocaine. Pure cocaine is approximately 100 times more potent than coca leaves. It's a white crystalline powder that can be snorted, dissolved in water, and injected or applied topically to mucous membranes. The effects are immediate and dramatic. Energy surges through your body. Fatigue vanishes. Confidence soars. You feel alert, focused, capable of anything. Pain disappears. Hunger evaporates. You could work for 20 hours straight without rest. The medical establishment saw cocaine's potential immediately. Here was a painkiller that didn't cause sedation like opiates. It was a stimulant, not a depressant. Patients remained alert and functional while pain-free. What could be better? In the 1860s and 1870s, doctors began using cocaine for everything. They applied it topically for eye surgery, creating the first local anesthetic. They prescribed it for depression, declaring it a wonder drug for melancholy. They gave it to patients suffering from morphine or alcohol addiction, genuinely believing cocaine would help break those dependencies. The irony of treating one addiction by creating another was lost on them. By 1880, cocaine was available over the counter at any pharmacy. You didn't need a prescription. You could walk into a general store in any frontier town and buy cocaine in various forms. Powdered cocaine for mixing with water. Cocaine lozenges. Cocaine-laced tooth drops marketed for dental pain. Cocaine ointments and salves. All perfectly legal, widely advertised and endorsed by medical professionals. The marketing was aggressive and sophisticated. Pharmaceutical companies produced beautifully designed kits containing glass vials of cocaine solution, a glass syringe, and needles, all packaged in engraved tin cases. These kits were marketed to upper and middle-class consumers as essential medical supplies. The subtext was clear. Modern, educated people kept cocaine on hand for emergencies. One of the most successful cocaine products was Vin Mariani, a French tonic wine made by dissolving coca leaves in Bordeaux wine. The creator, Angelo Mariani, claimed it provided energy and vitality. He wasn't wrong. The wine contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. Regular drinkers consumed significant amounts of cocaine daily without necessarily realizing it. Vin Mariani became wildly popular in Europe and America. It attracted celebrity endorsements from Jules, Verne, Thomas Edison, and even Pope Leo XIII, who supposedly awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal and appeared on advertising posters. Whether these endorsements were genuine or fabricated is debatable, but the product's popularity was real. Millions of bottles sold annually. Inspired by Vin Mariani's success, American entrepreneurs developed similar products. The most famous was created by an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton in 1886. He called it Coca-Cola. The original formula contained extracts from coca leaves, which meant it contained cocaine. Not huge amounts, maybe 9 milligrams per glass, but enough to provide a noticeable lift. How much cocaine was in early Coca-Cola? Estimates vary. The company has never released exact figures from that era, and the formula was a trade secret. Some historians estimate between 5 and 9 milligrams per serving. That's a small dose by cocaine standards, but remember, people weren't drinking one glass. Regular customers might consume several servings daily, adding up to 30 or 40 milligrams. The cocaine in Coca-Cola, combined with caffeine from cola nuts, created a powerful stimulant effect. This wasn't accidental. Coca-Cola was marketed as a brain tonic and nerve stimulant. The cocaine was a feature, not a bug. It's why the drink became popular so quickly. People genuinely felt better after drinking it, but Coca-Cola was just one of hundreds of cocaine-containing products flooding the market. Manufacturers added cocaine to cough syrups, hay fever remedies, pain medications, and general tonics. It appeared in children's medicines marketed to soothe teething pain. Mothers gave their babies cocaine drops without realizing the danger. The idea that cocaine could be harmful seemed absurd. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacists recommended it. Respectable people used it. On the frontier, cocaine found particular appeal among laborers doing hard physical work. Miners, loggers, railroad workers, ranch hands, anyone whose livelihood depended on physical endurance, welcomed a drug that provided energy and suppressed appetite. Cocaine meant you could work longer hours without rest, food, or sleep. For employers, this was perfect. For workers, it seemed like a solution to the demands of brutal labor. Some employers actively encouraged or even provided cocaine to their workers. There are documented cases of mining companies distributing cocaine to crews working long shifts. The logic was straightforward. Cocaine-using workers were more productive. They complained less, worked harder, needed less time off. The long-term consequences, addiction, and health problems were someone else's problem. The cowboy stereotype of rugged independence fueled by whiskey and tobacco is partly true, but it's incomplete. Many cowboys used cocaine, especially during long cattle drives or when working as seasonal ranch hands. Cocaine helped them stay awake during night watches, provided energy for the physical demands of the work, and offered a different kind of relief than alcohol or opium. Where opium made you dreamy and disconnected, cocaine made you feel powerful and capable. But the dream had a dark side. Cocaine's effects last only an hour or two. As they wear off, users crash hard. Exhaustion, depression, irritability, and intense cravings for more cocaine follow. The solution was obvious. Take more cocaine. This led to patterns of repeated use throughout the day, with doses gradually increasing as tolerance built. Unlike opium, which could maintain addicts for years, cocaine addiction accelerated quickly and destructively. Heavy users became paranoid, anxious, and sometimes violent. They'd experience hallucinations, seeing or feeling things that weren't there. Some developed a sensation that insects were crawling under their skin, leading them to scratch themselves bloody trying to dig the imaginary bugs out. Cocaine psychosis was first documented in the 1880s, though doctors didn't initially connect it to the drug. They'd see patients presenting with paranoia, hallucinations, and aggressive behavior, but wouldn't think to ask about cocaine use because cocaine was medicine. The idea that medicine could cause mental illness didn't fit the prevailing understanding. As cases accumulated, the connection became undeniable. By the early 1890s, medical journals published articles warning about cocaine's dangers. Doctors reported patients experiencing heart problems, seizures, and death following cocaine use. The realization spread slowly that cocaine was not the miracle drug they'd believed it to be. It was, in fact, intensely dangerous. But the damage was done. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of Americans had been exposed to cocaine through medical use or consumer products. Many were addicted, and unlike opium, which had at least some legitimate medical uses that justified its availability, cocaine's medical applications were being questioned. The treatments it was supposed to provide could be achieved through other means. Its primary effect was simply stimulation, which doctors increasingly viewed as frivolous or dangerous. The social context of cocaine use differed from opium. Opium was associated with Chinese immigrants and veterans, carrying baggage of race and war. Cocaine, however, was initially seen as a modern, scientific, progressive drug. Upper and middle-class whites were prominent users. The racial dynamics shifted later, as cocaine use spread to black communities in the South, triggering racist panic about the drug making black people violent or uncontrollable. This led to some of the first anti-cocaine legislation, often explicitly racist in motivation. But before any real regulation appeared, another phenomenon needed to reach its peak. An entire industry had grown around taking advantage of people's trust, ignorance, and desperation. An industry that combined theatrical showmanship with pharmaceutical fraud. An industry that would eventually epitomize everything wrong with unregulated drug sales. The medicine show was about to have its moment in the sun, and it would burn bright before burning out. Picture a dusty town square somewhere in Kansas, summer of 1890. A crowd gathers as a brightly painted wagon rolls into town. On its side, elaborate lettering proclaims, "Dr. Kilmer's celebrated Indian remedy cures all known ailments." A man, in a fine suit and top hat, emerges, accompanied by a small band that begins playing lively music. This is a medicine show, and it's about to put on a performance. The medicine show was part entertainment, part sales pitch, and entirely fraudulent. These traveling shows crisscrossed the frontier throughout the late 19th century, bringing excitement to isolated towns while selling products that ranged from useless to deadly. The showmen were called pitchmen, and the best ones were charismatic performers who could sell anything to anyone. The show would start with entertainment. Musicians, singers, comedians, even acrobats or animal acts. The goal was to draw a crowd and put them in a good mood. After 30 minutes or so of free entertainment, the pitchman would begin his real work. He'd step forward and start talking about health, suffering, and the miracle cure he happened to have in his wagon. The pitches followed predictable patterns. The pitchman would describe common ailments in vivid, frightening terms. Rheumatism, that twisted joints and left you crippled. Consumption that filled your lungs with blood. Nervous disorders that drove you mad. Then he'd share testimonials from people supposedly cured by his medicine. Sometimes he'd have planted audience members who dramatically claimed they'd been healed. Other times, he'd read letters from distant customers, real or fabricated. Then came the science. The pitchman would explain his medicine's origins, usually involving Native American secrets, ancient Chinese wisdom, or European medical breakthroughs. The more exotic and implausible, the better. Dr. Kilmer's swamp root supposedly contained herbs from Florida swamps, known only to Seminole medicine. Hamlin's wizard oil claimed to be based on a formula discovered in Egyptian tombs. The stories were absurd, but they sounded impressive to rural audiences with limited education. After building sufficient interest, the pitchman would unveil his product. Bottles of dark liquid, tins of powder, jars of ointment. The packaging was always impressive, designed to look medical and official. And the promises were breathtaking. One medicine might claim to cure everything from cancer to baldness. Another would guarantee results for kidney disease, liver problems, and female complaints all at once. The prices were reasonable, usually between 50 cents and $2 per bottle. Affordable enough that even poor families might scrape together the money, especially if someone was suffering. The pitchman would emphasize the money-back guarantee, which meant nothing since he'd be in the next county by the time anyone realized the medicine didn't work. And of course, it didn't work. Not in the way promised. But here's the thing. It often did something, because most patent medicines contained powerful drugs. The most common ingredients were opium, morphine, cocaine, and alcohol. Lots of alcohol. Some products were 40 to 50% alcohol, making them stronger than whiskey. Take Hamlin's Wizard Oil, one of the most popular products. Analysis showed it contained ammonia, chloroform, sassafras, cloves, and alcohol. The alcohol content alone was enough to provide noticeable effects. Add in the chloroform, which has mild anesthetic properties, and you had a product that genuinely made pain decrease. It didn't cure anything, but it made you feel better temporarily. That was enough to generate repeat customers. Other products were more sinister. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was marketed specifically for teething babies and restless children. Mothers gave it freely, trusting that something labeled as safe for children must be harmless. The formula contained morphine. Each dose gave infants a significant amount of opiate. The babies stopped crying because they were drugged into unconsciousness. Some never woke up. How many children died from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup? The number is impossible to calculate. The product was sold for decades before its dangers were widely acknowledged. Thousands of infants and young children were exposed. Some certainly died from overdoses. Others may have suffered developmental damage. Parents were told their children died from disease or weakness, never knowing the medicine was responsible. The patent medicine industry was enormous. By 1890, Americans spent approximately $75 million annually on patent medicines. That's roughly $2 billion in modern currency. Hundreds of companies competed for this market, producing thousands of different products. Most were worthless. Many were dangerous. All were marketed with lies. The term patent medicine is misleading. Most of these products didn't have patents. The manufacturers kept their formulas secret specifically to avoid patent requirements that would reveal ingredients. The name came from earlier English letters, patent, granted by monarchs to certain medicines. But in America, it just became a catch-all term for proprietary medicines sold directly to consumers. The ingredients were rarely listed on labels. Customers had no idea what they were buying. A medicine might contain morphine, cocaine, mercury, arsenic, or any combination of substances. Some products contained multiple addictive drugs, ensuring customer dependency. Buy a bottle to cure your morphine addiction and discover it contains cocaine. Use it regularly and become addicted to both. The addictive business model was intentional. While some manufacturers may have been ignorant about their products' addictive properties, many knew exactly what they were doing. Create a customer's dependency, and you create a customer for life. It was brilliant and evil in equal measure. Patent medicines filled a real need, which is why they succeeded. Medical care on the frontier was limited and expensive. Doctors were scarce in rural areas. Many people couldn't afford professional medical help. When you're in pain, desperate, and poor, a bottle promising relief for $1 seems like a miracle. The fact that it was a lie didn't change the underlying need. The most vulnerable populations suffered most. Native Americans, already devastated by disease and displacement, were targeted by medicines claiming to use their traditional knowledge. The irony was cruel. African Americans in the post-Civil War South, facing poverty and discrimination, had limited access to real medical care and became dependent on patent medicines. Immigrants who didn't speak English well relied on pictures and promises, unable to read warnings that didn't exist anyway. But the tide was turning. Voices were rising in opposition to patent medicines, and they came from an unexpected source. The temperance movement, focused on alcohol prohibition, gradually realized that many patent medicines contained more alcohol than beer or wine. How could they advocate for prohibition while ignoring medicine bottles that were essentially hard liquor? With drugs added, women in temperance organizations began investigating patent medicines. They discovered morphine, cocaine, and alcohol in products. Marketed to children, they found medicines that were nothing but colored water. They documented deaths and addictions linked to specific products. And they started making noise. At the same time, journalists began exposing the patent medicine industry. The most famous was Samuel Hopkins Adams, who wrote a series of articles for Collier's magazine in 1905 titled The Great American Fraud. Adams investigated patent medicine companies, analyzed their products, and published the truth. He named names, He revealed ingredients. He documented deaths. His articles created a sensation. The public response was swift and angry. People felt betrayed. They'd trusted these medicines. They'd given them to their children. They'd spent money they couldn't afford on products that were worthless at best and deadly at worst. The pressure on politicians to act became irresistible. But before legislation could save the day, the pharmaceutical industry had one more trick up its sleeve. One more product that they'd claim was safe, non-addictive, and perfect for treating pain and addiction. A drug they'd market aggressively to doctors and consumers alike. A drug that would prove to be one of the most addictive substances ever created. Heroin was coming, and it came wrapped in legitimacy and medical authority that even morphine hadn't enjoyed. In 1898, the Bayer pharmaceutical company of Germany made an announcement that they believed would revolutionize medicine. Their chemists had discovered a new compound derived from morphine, created by adding two acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. This process, called diacetylation, produced a substance that was more potent, faster acting, and supposedly safer than morphine. They named it heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or strong. The name was marketing genius. Heroin sounded powerful, confident, modern. It suggested strength and effectiveness. Bayer claimed their new drug was everything morphine should have been. More effective for pain relief, better for respiratory conditions. And most importantly, they insisted heroin was non-addictive. They positioned it as the solution to morphine addiction, the drug that would finally free the hundreds of thousands of Americans trapped in opiate dependency. This was a lie, not a mistake or an error in judgment. A lie. Heroin is significantly more addictive than morphine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier faster, producing more intense euphoria, followed by more severe withdrawal. But either Bayer didn't know this, which seems unlikely given their resources and expertise, or they didn't care, which seems more probable given their aggressive marketing campaign. Bayer launched heroin and aspirin simultaneously, treating them as equally important medical breakthroughs. Aspirin for minor aches and pains. Heroin for serious conditions. The marketing materials were sophisticated and targeted directly at physicians. Bayer sent samples to doctors across America and Europe. They published articles in medical journals praising heroin's properties. They sponsored lectures and presentations at medical conferences. The medical establishment embraced heroin enthusiastically. Here was a powerful painkiller from a reputable pharmaceutical company, backed by scientific research and clinical trials. Doctors prescribed it freely, believing they were providing the best possible care, and the early reports were promising. Patients experienced pain relief without the sedation that morphine caused. Heroin seemed cleaner, more efficient. Bayer marketed heroin for an astonishing range of conditions. Coughs and colds topped the list. Heroin suppresses the cough reflex effectively, making it useful for bronchitis, tuberculosis, and other respiratory ailments. But the indications expanded rapidly. Asthma, pneumonia, hay fever, even regular coughs in healthy people. If you were coughing for any reason, heroin was the answer. Then came the pain indications: post-surgical pain, injury-related pain, chronic pain from various conditions. Heroin worked beautifully for these applications, which only reinforced physicians' confidence in the drug. Patients who'd been suffering for weeks or months found immediate relief. Of course, doctors prescribed it. It was a miracle. But the most disturbing use was for children. Bayer and other companies marketed heroin specifically for pediatric patients. Children's cough syrups contained heroin. Teething powders included it. Even infant formulas sometimes had heroin added. The logic was that if heroin was safe and non-addictive as claimed, there was no reason not to give it to children who were suffering. Parents trusted doctors and pharmaceutical companies. When a physician prescribed heroin cough syrup for a child's persistent cough, parents administered it faithfully. When a baby was restless or in pain, heroin drops provided relief. Nobody questioned it, because why would you? This was modern medicine, scientific progress, the best care available. The results were predictable to anyone except, apparently, the medical establishment. Children became addicted. Infants went through withdrawal when medication was discontinued. Some children who'd been given heroin for minor ailments became lifelong addicts. The scale of this disaster is impossible to calculate because records from the era are incomplete, but we're talking about potentially thousands of children exposed to heroin before their bodies were fully developed. Adults fared no better. The promise that heroin would cure morphine addiction proved false almost immediately. Doctors who tried using heroin to wean patients off morphine discovered they'd simply created heroin addicts instead. The cross-tolerance between morphine and heroin meant that morphine addicts could use heroin as a substitute, but they remained dependent on opiates. Some ended up addicted to both. Heroin withdrawal is notably worse than morphine withdrawal. It comes on faster and hits harder. Within 6 to 12 hours of the last dose, symptoms begin: restlessness and anxiety, then muscle aches that intensify into severe pain, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, sweating and chills alternating, insomnia despite overwhelming exhaustion, and the psychological symptoms: depression, panic, intense cravings that feel like they'll kill you. The withdrawal peaks around 3 days after the last dose, then gradually subsides over a week or two. But the psychological symptoms can persist for months: depression, anxiety, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from normal activities. Many addicts relapse during this phase, unable to tolerate a world that seems grey and empty without. Heroin. Despite mounting evidence of heroin's dangers, it remained widely prescribed through the early 1900s. The medical profession was slow to acknowledge the problem, partly due to pride and partly due to pharmaceutical company influence. Bayer continued marketing heroin aggressively, even as reports of addiction and overdose accumulated. They had invested heavily in heroin production and weren't eager to admit failure. By 1910, the truth was undeniable. Heroin was a disaster. Far from solving the morphine addiction crisis, it had created a new wave of addiction that was arguably worse. Cities saw increasing numbers of heroin addicts, many of whom had been introduced to the drug through medical treatment. The street market for heroin began developing as addicts who couldn't get prescriptions sought other sources. The frontier territories and western states weren't immune. Heroin reached every pharmacy and general store, just like morphine and cocaine before it. Cowboys, miners, ranchers, and townspeople who might have avoided opium dens or morphine injection found themselves addicted to heroin through perfectly legal prescriptions. Some started with heroin and later switched to other opiates when heroin became harder to obtain. Others stayed loyal to heroin, chasing that initial rush that nothing else could match. The pattern repeated endlessly. Someone would develop a cough or injury. A doctor would prescribe heroin. Relief would be immediate and profound. The patient would take it as directed, then request refills. Within weeks or months, they'd need the drug not for pain relief, but to avoid withdrawal. They'd increase their doses as tolerance built. Eventually, their lives would revolve around securing their next supply. Some heroin addicts maintained functionality for years. Heroin doesn't impair cognitive function or motor skills the way alcohol does. As long as addicts had access to their drug, they could work, maintain relationships, and appear normal. But the cost was constant. Money drained away on an ever-increasing habit. Time spent securing supplies, finding doctors who'd prescribe, or buying from illegal sources as regulations slowly tightened. Others spiraled quickly. They'd lose jobs due to erratic behavior or absences when supplies ran short. Families would discover the addiction and react with shock or anger. Social stigma was intensifying as the public became more aware of addiction's nature. What had been seen as a medical problem was increasingly viewed as a moral failing, especially as knowledge spread that heroin was dangerous and addictive. The tide was turning against heroin specifically and opiates generally. Medical journals published studies demonstrating heroin's addictive properties. Doctors began prescribing it less frequently. Some hospitals and clinics stopped using it entirely, returning to morphine or experimenting with newer painkillers. Bayer's reputation suffered as the heroin debacle became public knowledge. But Bayer wasn't the only company producing heroin. Once the patent situation was clarified, numerous manufacturers began making their own versions. Some were pharmaceutical, companies with at least nominal quality control. Others were fly-by-night operations producing heroin of dubious purity and strength. The market fragmented and became more dangerous as regulation lagged behind supply. By 1914, heroin addiction was recognized as a major social problem. The exact numbers were unknown, but estimates suggested tens of thousands of Americans were dependent on heroin, many introduced through medical use. This was in addition to the hundreds of thousands addicted to morphine, laudanum, and other opiates. The scope of the addiction crisis was staggering. Something had to change. The question was what and how. America had largely ignored its opiate problem for decades, treating it as an unfortunate side effect of medical progress. But the accumulation of suffering, the wasted lives, the families destroyed, and the social costs had reached a point where action became necessary. Multiple forces were converging to demand change. The temperance movement was at its peak, advocating for alcohol prohibition, but increasingly concerned about drugs. Progressive reformers saw addiction as a social ill requiring government intervention. Medical professionals recognized that unregulated drugs were causing more harm than good. And the public was becoming aware that the miracle medicines they'd trusted were killing their children. The stage was set for prohibition. Not alcohol prohibition, not yet, though that was coming. Drug prohibition. Restrictions on opium, morphine, cocaine, and heroin that would fundamentally reshape American society. The consequences would be complex, unintended, and still reverberating more than a century later. The first cracks in the wall of legal drug availability appeared in the 1880s and 1890s at the state and local level. Some cities banned opium dens, though enforcement was selective and often targeted Chinese proprietors while ignoring white-owned establishments. Some states required prescriptions for certain drugs, though pharmacists often sold them anyway. These early attempts at regulation were scattered, inconsistent, and largely ineffective. The real change came from international pressure. In 1909, the United States participated in the International Opium Commission in Shanghai. This conference brought together nations concerned about opium trade and use, particularly the problems created by Western powers forcing opium on Asian countries. The conference produced recommendations, not binding agreements, but it signaled a shift in thinking. Domestically, the pressure for action intensified. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, responding to scandals exposed by journalists and reformers. This act didn't ban drugs, but it required accurate labeling. Patent medicines had to list their ingredients. This simple requirement killed many products immediately. Once customers knew that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine, or that Coca-Cola contained cocaine, demand dropped sharply. The patent medicine industry fought back, reformulating products to remove or reduce drug content. Coca-Cola removed cocaine from its formula gradually between 1903 and 1929, though the company used decoconized coca leaves for flavoring. Other manufacturers simply found ways to obscure their ingredients or lied on labels, betting that enforcement would be lax. They often won that bet, but the Pure Food and Drug Act was just the beginning. The real hammer fell in 1914 with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. This federal law didn't technically ban drugs, but it imposed strict requirements on anyone who manufactured, imported, or distributed opiates and cocaine. Doctors and pharmacists had to register, pay taxes, and keep detailed records of all transactions. Prescriptions were required for any opiate or cocaine product. More significantly, the Harrison Act specified that doctors could only prescribe narcotics for legitimate medical purposes. Addiction itself was not considered a legitimate medical purpose. This meant that doctors couldn't prescribe opiates to addicts simply to maintain their addiction or help them withdraw. The law's intent was to end the practice of doctors supplying addicts, but the effect was to criminalize addiction. Almost overnight, hundreds of thousands of addicts lost their legal supply. Doctors who'd been willing to prescribe maintenance doses stopped, fearing prosecution. Pharmacies refused to fill prescriptions that seemed suspicious. The addicts didn't stop being addicted, though. They simply turned to illegal sources. The black market that emerged was inevitable. Where there's demand, supply follows. Criminal. Networks began importing and distributing opiates and cocaine. Prices increased dramatically. Purity decreased. Violence entered the picture as competitors fought for market share. The drug trade that would eventually spawn cartels and fuel gang wars had its origins in the Harrison Act's unintended consequences. The opium dens began closing, driven out of business by enforcement and social pressure. Some moved underground, operating secretly. Others shut down permanently. The Chinese communities that had maintained these establishments faced intensified discrimination and violence. The racism that had always surrounded opium use found new justification in prohibition. For the addicts themselves, prohibition was a nightmare. People who'd been functioning members of society, maintaining jobs and families, while dependent on legally obtained drugs, suddenly became criminals. They faced arrest for possession. They struggled to find supplies. Some turned to crime to fund their now expensive habits. Others attempted to quit cold turkey and suffered terribly. A few progressive. Doctors tried to help. They established addiction clinics where addicts could receive maintenance doses in controlled settings. The idea was harm reduction. Keep addicts stable while they worked on recovery. But these clinics were quickly shut down by federal authorities, who saw them as violating the Harrison Act's spirit. The message was clear. There was no legal path for addiction treatment that involved giving addicts the drugs they were addicted to. The human cost of prohibition is impossible to calculate precisely. How many people died from impure street drugs? How many overdosed because they couldn't gauge potency? How many committed suicide rather than face arrest or suffer through withdrawal? The records from this era are incomplete and unreliable, but we know the suffering was immense. Some addicts did successfully quit during this period. The forced unavailability of their drug left them no choice but to endure withdrawal. Those with family support, financial resources, or extraordinary willpower sometimes made it through, but they were the minority. Most either found illegal sources, switched to legal alternatives like alcohol, or died. The Wild West's drug epidemic didn't end cleanly. It metastasized into the urban drug problems of the 20th century. The addicts of the frontier became the addicts of the cities, their descendants inheriting both biological vulnerabilities and social circumstances that perpetuated addiction across generations. The lessons that should have been learned about the dangers of unregulated pharmaceuticals and the importance of treating addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing were largely ignored. In 1920, alcohol prohibition began with the 18th Amendment, extending the prohibitionist approach to the country's most popular drug. The results were predictably disastrous. Organized crime flourished, violence increased, and drinking continued in speakeasies and private homes. Prohibition was eventually repealed in 1933, acknowledged as a failed experiment. But drug prohibition remained, and remains to this day, despite evidence that it creates many of the same problems. The irony is thick. The drugs that ran rampant in the Wild West, morphine, opium, cocaine, and heroin, were legal and widely available. Addiction rates were high, and suffering was real, but the drugs themselves were cheap, pure, and accessible. Prohibition made them illegal, but didn't eliminate demand. It just made everything more dangerous. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the drugged frontier. We've seen opium dens full of cowboys seeking escape. We've seen Civil War veterans trapped in morphine addiction, their reward for surviving hell. We've seen women drinking, laudanum in their kitchens, slowly disappearing into a fog they couldn't escape. We've seen children dosed with heroin, their parents trusting that medicine meant safety. We've seen snake oil salesmen peddling addiction in bottles, getting rich on human misery. The Wild West drug epidemic killed thousands directly through overdose, tens of thousands through the slow grinding destruction of addiction, and countless more through the ripple effects on families and communities. It was a catastrophe, but one that happened quietly, person by person, in ways that were easy to ignore until the scale became undeniable. What do we take from this history? A few things, perhaps. First, that pharmaceutical companies will lie to sell products. Bayer lied about heroin. Patent medicine manufacturers lied about everything. The profit motive overwhelms ethics reliably when regulation is absent. Second, that doctors can be wrong, sometimes spectacularly so. The physicians who prescribed morphine for morphine addiction, cocaine for opium addiction, and heroin as a safe alternative to morphine were doing their best, but their best was terrible. Medical authority deserves respect but not blind trust. Third, that addiction is a medical condition, not a moral failing. The people who became addicted to opiates in the 19th century weren't weak or bad. They were in pain, seeking relief, trusting the authorities who prescribed their medicines. They deserve compassion, not judgment. And fourth, that prohibition doesn't solve addiction. It just drives it underground and makes it more dangerous. The parallels to today's opioid crisis are impossible to ignore. Pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketing addictive painkillers, doctors prescribing them freely, believing assurances of safety, patients becoming addicted through legitimate medical treatment. A regulatory response that focuses on criminalization rather than treatment. Deaths mounting as the black market provides increasingly dangerous products. It's the same pattern repeating, because we didn't learn the lessons history offered. Picture one last scene with me. An abandoned building somewhere in Nevada, a ghost town slowly being reclaimed by the desert. In what was once a pharmacy, broken bottles litter the floor. On a shelf, miraculously intact, sits a small brown bottle with a faded label. Laudanum, someone's solution to their pain, sitting undisturbed for a century. The bottle is empty now. The person who bought it is long dead, along with everyone they knew. But the drug crisis continues in different forms, with different names, in different places. The Wild West of unregulated drugs is gone, but the wilderness of human suffering remains. Understanding where we've been doesn't guarantee we won't make the same mistakes, but it gives us a chance to do better, to treat addiction with compassion, to regulate pharmaceuticals with skepticism, to remember that every addict is someone's child, parent, friend. The drugs that ran rampant in the Wild West aren't a historical curiosity. They're a warning we've repeatedly failed to heed. Maybe this time we'll finally listen. Thank you for watching.